8 nights after the explosion. I lay alone in my burn unit room when the door opened at 11:47 p.m. A health inspector stepped inside, locked the door, and started searching my belongings. My daughter had visited hours earlier, held my hand, and promised everything would be fine. She'd sent him. I couldn't move, but I watched exactly where his hands went. He reached for the one thing that could save me. But to understand what he was looking for, I need to take you back to the night everything started. I appreciate you settling in with me for this one. Before we begin, do me a small favor. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with everything you built, only to find out they had other plans? Yes or no? I'd love to know. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling and reflection. The message behind it all is what truly matters. 8 nights after the explosion that should have killed me. I lay alone in the burn unit at Dell Seton Medical Center when the door handle turned at 11:47 p.m. I knew the sound wasn't a nurse. Nurses knock. They announce themselves with that practiced cheerfulness that's supposed to make you forget you're wrapped in gauze from your wrists to your shoulders. This was different, slow, deliberate. The handle depressed all the way before the latch released. Whoever was on the other side didn't want to be heard. My name is Vernon Keach. I'm 70 years old. I built Keach's Smokehouse from a single $600 truck into a chain worth $60 million. And 8 days ago, someone blew up my kitchen with me inside it. Second-degree burns across both arms. 3 fractured ribs. A concussion that turned the ceiling into a carousel for 2 days straight. My daughter Lorene had visited that afternoon, held my hand, kissed my forehead, told me the restaurants were running fine and not to worry about a thing. I believed her. That was my first mistake. The door opened. A man in a white lab coat stepped inside, eased the door shut, and locked it. He pulled the privacy curtain around my bed in one smooth motion, the metal rings scraping along the rail like teeth on a zipper. Then he leaned over me and pressed his palm flat against my mouth. His name was Nolan Pruitt, 44, a state health inspector with 17 years of service and, as I would learn later, $120,000 in payments he couldn't explain to anyone with a badge. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the weight of his hand, the smell of antiseptic burn cream mixing with his cheap cologne, and the fact that his eyes weren't looking at me. They were scanning the room, the bedside table, the IV stand, the gap beneath the mattress. He was searching for something. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. "I'm here because someone in your family wants you to never leave this room." How do you fight a man you can't see, from a bed you can't leave, when the only person you trust might be the one who put you there? I didn't move. I watched him. The burns across my arms screamed with every heartbeat, gauze pulling against raw skin as my body tensed. But I kept my breathing even, and my eyes locked on his. He wasn't here to kill me. A killer wouldn't talk first. He wanted something, and whatever it was, he needed me alive to get it. "Your daughter," he said, leaning close enough that I could taste the copper tang of my own adrenaline at the back of my throat. "She's not who you think she is. Ask yourself, who paid for—" He stopped. Footsteps in the corridor, rubber soles on linoleum, steady and coming closer. Pruitt's hand lifted from my mouth. He straightened his lab coat, glanced once at the locked door, and pulled the curtain back. The fluorescent corridor light sliced under the door and caught the sweat on his forehead. "We're done," he said. And then he was gone out the door, past whoever was walking that hallway, swallowed by the hospital like he'd never been there at all. I lay in the dark with his half-sentence burning hotter than anything on my skin. Ask yourself, who paid for what? The explosion, the hospital bills, something else entirely, and Lorene. My Lorene, who'd kissed my forehead 6 hours ago and smelled like the magnolia perfume her mother used to wear. $600. That's what the whole empire cost. To start a used smoker, a folding table, and my wife Eleanor's handwritten recipe for mesquite dry rub. 41 years later, someone wanted to take $60 million worth of it while I lay wrapped in gauze. And the man who just told me so had disappeared before finishing his sentence. I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. Not a loud one. Not the kind you announce. The kind that settles into your chest like a coal that won't go out. 8 weeks later. I walked through the gates of Keach's Smokehouse flagship in Round Rock wearing my old BBQ apron over a dress shirt, carrying a weathered wooden recipe box that had belonged to Eleanor. 300 guests, 40 years of employees. My daughter at the podium. Mid-speech, her mouth still open on a word she'd never finish. None of them were expecting me. I built this place with Eleanor's recipe box. And that afternoon I carried it back through those gates, but the recipes weren't inside anymore. What was inside was 41 years of proof that the person behind that podium had tried to bury me alive. I walked in. But this story doesn't start at the gala. It starts 41 years before it, with a rusted smoker truck and a woman who changed my life with a rack of beef ribs. The first thing my wife ever cooked on that smoker was so perfect that 3 strangers pulled off Highway 79 just to find the smell. Ear stood there in cut-off jeans and a bandana, turning ribs on a grate we'd salvaged from a church barbecue pit. And when those men offered her $20 a plate, she looked at me and said, "Vernon, I think we're in business." That 1985. The truck cost me $600. The gravel lot outside Round Rock cost nothing because the rancher owed my father a favor. And Eleanor's recipe, the mesquite dry rub she'd spent 2 years perfecting in our apartment kitchen, cost everything that came after. She had a wooden recipe box her mother had given her as a wedding gift. Cedar, hand-sanded, with a brass latch that stuck in the humidity. Inside it, she kept every formula she ever created, the signature rub, the cornbread, the vinegar slaw, the pecan pie glaze that a Dallas food critic once called the best thing he'd eaten south of the Red River. "This box holds every recipe I'll ever give you," she told me once. "Guard it like you guard Lorene." Lorene, our daughter, born in 1988, 3 years after the truck, the same year we opened the first brick-and-mortar location. She grew up in smoke. She could identify post oak from mesquite by smell before she could read. When Eleanor got sick in 2004, Lorene was 16 and already running the weekend shift at the flagship. When Eleanor died 2 years later, Lorene was 18. Standing beside me at the funeral, and she grabbed my arm and said, "I'll never let this chain leave the family, Daddy. I swear." I raised that girl alone for 20 years after that. I taught her the business supply chains, vendor contracts, lease negotiations, everything except the recipes, which stayed in Eleanor's box. I never taught her what the business cost me to build. The 4 a.m. mornings, the 2 years I didn't take a salary, the $22 million in real estate I'd quietly folded into branch properties and a family trust over 3 decades. Money that didn't show on the operating books. Money that even Lorene didn't fully understand. Part of the same $60 million the chain was worth on paper, just none of it sitting where a bank statement could find it. $60 million looks like a man standing in wood smoke at 4 in the morning. Alone for 40 years. It doesn't look like anything worth stealing, but it was. We grew to 6 flagship locations across the Austin-Dallas corridor, 45 total with the satellite joints. I turned 70 and didn't slow down. The Father's Day cookout gala was my tradition every year since Eleanor died. I'd fire up the original smoker at the Round Rock flagship and cook for 300 guests myself. It was the one night I didn't feel alone. Early that spring, the night before gala prep was supposed to begin, I drove to the flagship at 10:30 for a late test run. The kitchen was empty. The prep crew had gone home. I walked in the way I'd walked in 10,000 times through the back door, past the cold storage, into the smoker room where Eleanor and I had built the first permanent grill station in 1992. The gas company had inspected that line 11 days earlier. The report said no issues found. Someone signed that report. I'd think about that signature a lot over the next 8 weeks. I reached for the pilot on smoker number 1. My hand knew the valve the way a pianist knows middle C. I turned it. But the gas didn't hiss the way it always had. It screamed a high, pressurized shriek that lasted maybe half a second before the air turned orange. The fireball threw me 6 feet backward into the prep counter. I heard my ribs crack before I felt them. I hit the concrete floor, and my forearms were already burning. The skin splitting under heat that no kitchen accident should produce. Ash and copper flooded my mouth. The stainless steel surfaces around me reflected the fire like mirrors in hell. I lay on my back, staring up at a ceiling I'd built with my own hands 34 years ago. And the pain was everywhere. My arms, my ribs, my skull where it had struck the counter's edge. But I could still see. And what I saw, in the 3 seconds before the dark swallowed me, was the gas valve above the ruptured line. The cap was gone, and the coupling bore the fresh, clean scratches of a wrench that was not mine. Eleanor's recipe box sat on the prep shelf above me, untouched by the flames, as if she'd shielded it herself. I woke up to a face I didn't recognize. And that was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was that he wasn't surprised to see me. Dr. Reed Callister, 52. Attending burn surgeon at Del Seaton Medical Center, stood at the foot of my bed reviewing a chart he never once looked up from. He had the kind of calm that didn't come from experience. It came from preparation. He already knew what he was going to say before I opened my eyes. And that told me he'd been briefed before I arrived. Mr. Keach, the burns are manageable, but the graft schedule is non-negotiable, he said, still reading. 2nd degree across both forearms and the left side of your torso. 4 fractured ribs from the impact, grade 2 concussion. We're looking at 2 surgeries, 4 weeks apart. And any infection resets the clock entirely. He explained every procedure with textbook precision. The silver sulfadiazine dressings glinting under fluorescent light. The staged skin grafts. The 8-week minimum before I could stand without assistance. He answered questions I hadn't asked and anticipated concerns I hadn't raised. Not once did he ask how the explosion happened. Not once. A doctor who doesn't ask how, that's a doctor who already knows. When can I make phone calls? I asked. When the swelling in your hands allows you to hold a phone. Mr. Keach, not before. He said it like medical advice. It sounded like offense. My hands were wrapped so thick I couldn't feel my own fingers. The bandages across my ribcage tightened with every breath, and the metallic residue of anesthesia still coated the back of my tongue like I'd been chewing on old pennies. I was 70 years old, alone in a burn unit, unable to grip a telephone, and the only person who'd seen me so far was a surgeon who treated my near death like a scheduling problem. 8 weeks in a hospital bed is not recovery. It is a cage with an IV drip, and someone had just locked the door from the outside. The next morning, day 2. I heard 2 knuckle raps on the open door. I turned my head slowly, because the concussion made everything tilt, and saw a man I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. Breck Fielding, 58. Private equity investor out of a firm called Fielding Capital Partners, headquartered in the Domain up in Austin. He walked in carrying a gift basket wrapped in cellophane and wearing a pressed linen shirt with polished loafers that clicked on the hospital linoleum like he was arriving at a board meeting. I knew Fielding because 6 years earlier he'd offered to buy my chain for $33 million, 45% below what it was worth. And I'd told him no in language that didn't require a translator. He smiled like none of that had happened. "Vernon, I heard about the gas line," he said, setting the basket on the windowsill. "Terrible thing. You know my offer from 6 years ago still stands, not to buy, just to help. Steady hands while you heal." I watched him from the bed. The burn cream's chemical sweetness filled the room, and underneath it I could smell his cologne. something expensive and deliberate. The kind of scent a man wears when he wants you to remember he was there. How does a man you turned down 6 years ago show up at your bedside 12 hours before your own daughter, with a gift basket, and the cause of the fire already on his lips? Because I hadn't told a soul it was the gas line. The fire marshal hadn't filed yet. The report was still pending. The only people on earth who knew what ruptured in that kitchen were me and whoever had loosened the coupling. I lay there with my swollen hands and my fractured ribs and let Fielding talk. Because a man who talks too much will always tell you more than he means to. He talked about the chain's quarterly numbers as if he'd read them. He mentioned 2 of my satellite locations by name, the ones in Pflugerville and Cedar Park, as though he'd driven past them recently. He spoke about my insurance coverage with a specificity that made my jaw tighten. Then he paused at the doorway and adjusted his cuff. "Lorene has my number," he said. "I told her to call if the chain needs anything at all." He said it the way a man confirms a plan already in motion, not one being offered. And lying there, unable to move, unable to call anyone. I understood something that changed everything. Fielding had spoken to my daughter before coming here. Before I had even opened my eyes. 2 hours later, Lorene walked through that same door. And the first thing she reached for was not my hand, it was my company phone on the bedside table. She caught herself. "I'll give her that." Her fingers were already closing around the phone on the bedside table when she stopped, blinked, and reached for my hand instead. But I'd seen the order. I'd seen what came first. "Daddy," she said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." My daughter, Lorene Keach, 38 years old, the MBA-educated operations director who had run my chain's daily logistics since her mother died. She had Eleanor's jawline and my stubbornness, and a way of entering a room that made you feel like everything was about to be handled. The baby was on her hip, my granddaughter, barely 4 months old, still carrying the faint marks of NICU monitors on her tiny chest, asleep in a knitted blanket, as though the world outside it did not exist. Lorene set the baby's carrier on the chair, pulled a folder from her bag, and started talking before I could ask a single question. "I've already called every branch manager," she said. "Supply runs are covered through next week. The Pflugerville location had a walk-in cooler issue, but it's resolved. I just need you to sign these so I can authorize the big vendor payments. They were pre-approved before your accident." She laid emergency power of attorney documents on the bed tray. Keach's smokehouse letterhead, laser-printed, formatted with clause numbers and notary lines. I looked at them, with bandaged hands that could barely hold the pen she offered me. Let me tell you something about trust. It doesn't break all at once. It frays. One thread, then another. So slowly you keep holding on to something that's already falling apart in your hands. I trusted my daughter the way I trusted the sunrise. But those documents were not drafted that afternoon. They were pre-printed. The date line was blank, but the formatting was finished, the language polished, the signature blocks already positioned. Lorene had these ready before the fire. "You always were faster than me, baby girl," I said. I meant it as pride. It tasted like something else, a sourness forming at the back of my throat, where pride used to sit. She guided the pen into my swollen fingers and I signed. 3 pages, initials on the 4th. I watched her slide the folder back into her bag with the efficiency of someone checking an item off a list. Not someone relieved her father was alive. "The chain is safe, Daddy," she said. "Just focus on healing. I'll handle everything." Her heels clicked on the linoleum as she gathered her things. She kissed the baby's head, adjusted the blanket, and left the carrier beside my bed. "I'll be back tonight," she said from the doorway. Then she was gone, and I was alone with my granddaughter and the smell of baby powder mixing with antiseptic, and the quiet hum of a heart monitor that couldn't measure what I was actually feeling. Day 3. The baby slept in the bassinet the nurses had brought. her tiny fist curled around the edge of the hospital blanket. Her breathing so shallow I kept checking to make sure it hadn't stopped. She had her mother's jawline, 4 months old, and already carrying the face of a woman who'd been dead 20 years. I would have done anything for that child. So would Lorene. That was the problem. Because lying there in the half-dark, listening to my granddaughter breathe, I started remembering things I hadn't wanted to examine. 5 months earlier. This baby had been born premature, 47 days in the NICU. Ventilators, specialists, round-the-clock monitoring that cost more per hour than most people earn in a week. The bill came to $340,000. And when I offered to cover it, Lorene had shaken her head. "It's taken care of, Daddy," she'd said. "A friend helped. Please don't ask. I don't want to owe you two." She said she didn't want to owe me. What she meant was she already owed someone else. And $340,000 doesn't just disappear. Nobody pays that kind of money without buying something in return. I lay in the dark doing math I didn't want to finish. Fielding knew about the gas line before any report existed. Lorene had power of attorney documents ready before the fire. And 5 months ago, someone paid a fortune to make a medical crisis disappear. And my daughter wouldn't say who. 3 facts, 1 question. I closed my eyes and asked it in the silence of that room. With my granddaughter's breath the only sound and the weight of her bassinet pressed against my bed rail. "What did you trade for that money?" Lorene. By morning, I would hear her voice in the corridor outside my door, cold, transactional. A tone I had never heard from my daughter in 38 years. And the conversation she was having would answer more than I was ready for. The voice in the corridor was my daughter's, but the woman using it was someone I'd never met. I'd heard it the night before, muffled, quick. A tone stripped of everything warm. By morning, I was telling myself I'd imagined it. That the painkillers were bending sounds into shapes they didn't belong in. Then I picked up my tablet from the bedside tray, typed in my login for the Keach's Smokehouse vendor portal, and the screen told me my password had been changed at 2:14 a.m., 2:14 in the morning. While I slept with my arms wrapped in silver dressings and my ribs aching every time I breathed, someone had logged into the company system and locked me out. Not a glitch, not an expiration, a deliberate reset, time-stamped and precise. I set the tablet down and waited for Lorene. She arrived at 11, pumping hand sanitizer at the door the way she always did, the same 2 pumps, the same rub between her palms. A gesture that used to feel caring and now felt rehearsed. "No baby today." I asked why. "Sitter canceled," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. But I'd heard a second voice in the corridor before she walked in, low, male, gone before the door opened. I filed it. "Lorene, who changed the vendor for the Round Rock brisket supply?" "It's just temporary optimization." "Daddy, the old vendor had a backlog." I asked about the Pflugerville cold chain protocol. Same answer, same words, just temporary optimization. I asked about the Cedar Park location's weekend staffing. She tilted her head and said it a 3rd time. "Temporary optimization, Daddy," word for word, like a line she'd memorized for exactly these questions. Suspicion is not a switch. It's a leak. It starts as a drip you can ignore, then a trickle you explain away. And by the time you hear it roaring behind the wall, the foundation is already gone. I wasn't there yet. I was at the trickle stage, pressing my bandaged fingers against the tablet, 1 key at a time, trying passwords I'd used for 20 years and watching each one fail. Day 5. Lorene came in the afternoon, stayed 40 minutes, checked her phone 11 times, I counted. She adjusted my IV line the way the nurses had shown her. Brought me a brisket sandwich from the Cedar Park location that tasted nothing like our recipe, and talked about weather in Austin as though I were a stranger in a waiting room. Then evening came, and she thought I was asleep. I'd learned to fake it by then. Steady breathing, slack jaw, eyes not quite shut but close enough in the dim light. She stood in the doorway with her back to me, the corridor fluorescence framing her silhouette, and her phone lit up with no ring. She answered on the first vibration. "I said I'd handle it," she whispered. Her voice dropped an octave mid-sentence into a register I had never heard in 38 years of raising her. "Stop calling this number. He's not suspicious he's hurt and medicated. Just give me the week." He's not suspicious. He's hurt and medicated. My own daughter, reducing me to a condition report for someone on the other end of a phone. The bile rose so fast I had to swallow twice to keep my breathing steady. I gripped the starched sheet with both hands, gauze pulling against raw skin, and I did not move. She was afraid. That was the part I couldn't rationalize away. I've heard Lorene angry she threw a binder at a vendor a few years back, and I had to apologize for a week. I've heard her grieve, she sobbed into my chest, at Eleanor's funeral, until my shirt was soaked through. I've heard her laugh until she wheezed, but I had never heard her afraid of the person she was talking to. Whoever was on that line owned a piece of her she hadn't given willingly. She ended the call, locked the screen with a soft click, and stood there for a moment. I kept my eyes closed. She walked back to the chair, gathered her bag, kissed my forehead, and left without saying goodbye. I opened my eyes in the dark and replayed every word. She had said, "Stop calling this number," which meant there was another number, a second phone, a second line, a channel I had never known existed. One she used for the person she was afraid of. One that connected my daughter to whatever had put me in this bed. I stared at the ceiling and made a second decision. The first one, the night of the explosion, had been instinct. This one was architecture. I was going to find out who was on the other end of that call. 3 nights later, at 11:47 p.m., the door handle would turn again. And this time, I would be ready. 3 days of cataloging lies had sharpened me into something my daughter hadn't planned for. And at 11:47 p.m. on night 8, when the door handle turned without a knock, I was awake and waiting. I'd spent those 3 days learning to watch without being watched. Faking sleep, counting Lorene's phone checks, memorizing the phrases she repeated like scripture. By the time that handle moved, I wasn't the same man who'd woken up in this burn unit. I was something quieter and colder. And whoever was about to walk through that door was going to tell me more than they intended. The man entered in a white lab coat 2 sizes too large at the shoulders. He eased the door shut, locked it, and pulled the privacy curtain in one smooth motion. I recognized the choreography from the cold sweat I'd been replaying every night. This was the same intrusion I'd survived in my memory 100 times. But now I wasn't terrified. I was taking notes. "Mr. Keach, I'm with the State Health Department," he said. "Routine patient safety audit." His voice was calm, practiced, but his cologne cheap, sharp. Something you'd buy at a drugstore didn't belong in a hospital at midnight. And neither did he. His name was Nolan Pruitt, and I'd met him before, in this room, though the first time I'd been too medicated to understand what I was seeing. This time was different. This time I watched his eyes instead of listening to his words. And his eyes were not conducting an audit. He moved through the room with the systematic patience of a man who'd been told exactly what to look for. He opened the bedside drawer while talking about Lorene, his mouth saying my daughter's name, his fingers tracing the back panel of the drawer, feeling for something taped or hidden. He checked behind the IV stand. He lifted the edge of my mattress with one hand while the other gestured toward the window, as if making a point about ventilation standards. 40 years in the restaurant business teaches you how to read a room. Not a dining room, a room with one man lying in it and another man lying to him. Your daughter has been making calls that don't match her job description, Pruitt said, moving toward the sink. Ask yourself who benefits if you stay in this bed. He was good. The warnings about Lorene sounded urgent, genuine, even protective. A weaker man, a man who hadn't spent 3 days cataloging his own daughter's deceptions, might have believed the performance. But I'd been watching his hands, not his face, and his hands told a different story. Every surface he touched was a surface he searched. Every pause in his monologue was a moment he used to scan a new section of the room. I clenched my fists beneath the blanket, nails pressing into bandaged palms, and swallowed the metallic taste of adrenaline with practiced stillness. "What exactly are you looking for?" He froze. Half a second, maybe less. The only honest moment in the entire visit. His eyes stopped moving, and his shoulders locked, and for that sliver of time, he was not a state inspector delivering a warning. He was a man caught. Then the mask came back. He smiled. "Just making sure you're safe. Mr. Keach, if he was here to warn me, why did he check under my mattress? If he was here to protect me, why did his hand stop at the drawer where I kept my phone?" The questions stacked themselves behind my eyes while I held his gaze and said nothing. Footsteps in the corridor. Rubber soles, steady, coming closer. Pruitt's head turned toward the door. He straightened the lab coat, stepped back from the bed, and moved toward the exit with the ease of a man who had practiced leaving rooms quickly. But I saw it. The last place his eyes touched before the door closed, not the drawer, not the IV stand, not the mattress edge he'd already checked. The wooden shelf above the sink, where Eleanor's recipe box sat exactly where the paramedics had placed it the night they brought me in. He was gone. The corridor swallowed him the way it had last time, rubber soles fading into silence. I lay in the dark with my ribs aching and my arms burning, and my mind running cleaner than it had in years. Someone had sent a state health inspector into a hospital room at midnight to find something specific. And whatever it was, they believed it was in my wife's recipe box. I looked at that box on the shelf cedar, hand-sanded, brass latch, and made a decision. By morning, I would have a phone that Lorene didn't know about, and the first call I made on it would be to the one person in my supply chain I still trusted. The night shift nurse slipped the prepaid phone into my blanket fold without a word. Her name was Delia Garza, 14 years on the burn unit at Del Seaton. The kind of woman who could read a patient's face the way I read a smoke ring. She knew the difference between a man asking for comfort and a man asking for a weapon. She didn't ask questions. She just left the phone and closed the door. I waited until the corridor went quiet. Then I pressed the cheap plastic against my ear with gauze-wrapped fingers and dialed a number I'd known for 20 years. Harlan Odom, 56 years old. Financial controller across all our locations since 2004. The year Eleanor got sick, and I needed someone I could trust with every number in the business. He still kept a thank you card from Eleanor in his desk drawer. He answered on the first ring. "Vernon." His voice was flat, not surprised, relieved. "Thank God. I didn't know who to call." "Talk to me." "Harlan." He'd been pulling records since the week I was hospitalized. Quietly. Without triggering system alerts because something started bothering him the day after my explosion. 16 invoices in 10 days, he said. Everyone signed with Lorene's digital authorization code. The vendors don't exist in our system before April 3rd. Someone created them the day after your accident. New accounts, new routing numbers, new everything. How much? 1.2 million redirected so far. And Vernon, the routing numbers traced to a bank I've never seen in 45 locations worth of bookkeeping. This isn't sloppy. This is architecture. 16 invoices, her code on every one. I wanted Harlan to be wrong the way a man standing in front of an X-ray wants the doctor to say it's nothing. But numbers don't lie. Numbers never learned how. Harlan walked me through the structure. Each fake vendor had a name that sounded legitimate. Supply companies, maintenance firms, consulting groups, but none matched real businesses. The payments were sized to stay under internal audit thresholds. spread across locations so no single branch manager would spot the pattern. Whoever designed it understood our systems from the inside. Harlan, how long have you known him? The IV pump hummed beside me, marking time. 4 days, he said. I noticed on April 6th. I should have called you. But if Loreen's code is on these invoices, then either she's doing this, or someone has her credentials. I didn't know who was safe. His voice was steady, the way a man's voice is steady when he's been scared for days and has run out of room to be more scared. He wasn't reporting. He was confessing he'd been too afraid to act sooner. I understood. Fear doesn't make a man weak, it makes him late. You're safe. Harlan. You called the right person. Now tell me about the dates. He did. And the picture snapped into focus so hard I forgot to breathe. April 3rd. Every fake vendor account opened on April 3rd. My explosion was April 2nd. The accounts weren't created in response to an opportunity. They were activated by a signal. The fire wasn't an accident someone exploited. It was a starting gun. I gripped the phone tighter. Gauze pulling against raw skin, my mouth so dry I couldn't swallow. The blue glow of the screen lit my bandaged hands in the dark like something radioactive. Harlan. Who else in the company has the access level to create new vendor accounts? The line crackled. He exhaled a long breath that told me he'd already asked himself this question and hated the answer. Only 3 people. Vernon, you, me, and Loreen. I closed my eyes. But there's something else, he said. One of the routing numbers, I've seen it before. It showed up 18 months ago on a payment Loreen told me to file under charitable donations. I didn't question it then. $340,000. The NICU bill. The money that made a medical crisis disappear. The debt my daughter wouldn't name. It shared a banking pipeline with the vendors bleeding my company dry. The phone battery icon blinked red. 1 bar left, and one question that mattered more than sleep. Harlan. Hold everything you found. Don't move it. Don't copy it. Don't tell anyone. I'm calling someone who can trace where that money landed. The line went dead. I lay in the dark holding a phone with no charge and a truth with no mercy. And I thought about the one man I knew who could follow money the way a hound follows blood. The man I needed had spent 35 years following paper trails for the federal government. But when I called him from that burner phone, he told me this was the first trail that made him check the locks on his ranch house before sitting down to work. Grady Polston, 69 years old. Retired federal food safety inspector living on 40 acres outside Dripping Springs, with sun-creased hands, a drawl slow enough to hide a razor-sharp mind, and a kitchen table that looked like a war room by the time he called me back. We'd known each other since the late 90s. I'd hosted his retirement dinner at the flagship a few years back. He owed me nothing. He helped because that's who he was. The maintenance company is called Lone Star Combustion Services. Grady set his pen scratching notes I could hear through the static. Incorporated in Delaware last May. Registered agent, a law firm called Henshaw and Pruitt, out of Austin. I waited. Grady wasn't a man who buried the lead. Vernon Henshaw and Pruitt is the same firm that files Fielding Capital Partners' annual reports in Texas. The name hit me like a second explosion. Fielding. The man with the gift basket and the polished loafers. The man who knew about the gas line before the fire marshal did. Now his law firm was linked to the company that had last touched my smoker's gas coupling. Could be coincidence, I said, testing the word against my own judgment. Same law firm, different clients. Could be, Grady said. Except Lone Star Combustion has one client in 11 months of existence. One. Your flagship. A shell company is just a mask with a tax ID, and this one had been wearing a gas technician's uniform for 11 months, waiting for the right night to take it off. Grady kept digging. He pulled incorporation records, cross-referenced state licensing databases, called in favors from people who still owed him from his federal days. The picture he built across that yellow legal pad was precise and ugly. Lone Star Combustion had a single employee, a licensed gas technician named Boyd Shelton, 41. Previously installed commercial kitchens for a Fielding Capital portfolio company in Houston. Left that job 10 months ago. Started at Lone Star the same week the LLC was activated. One company, one employee, one client, one purpose. Shelton performed the routine inspection on your gas line on March 22nd, Grady said. 11 days before your explosion. Clean report, no issues found. The same inspection I'd thought about every night since the fire. The one somebody signed. Now I had the name of the hand that held the pen. This wasn't someone trying to kill me over a restaurant chain. Someone spent 11 months building the infrastructure to make my death look like a Tuesday night maintenance failure. That's not attempted murder, that's engineering. I gripped the burner phone so hard the plastic casing creaked against my bandages. Through the static I could hear Hill Country Cedar wind through Grady's open window, and the sound of a man turning pages who didn't want to turn the next one. Vernon, there's one more thing. I'd known Grady long enough to recognize that tone. It was the voice he used when the evidence was about to get worse than the theory. Boyd Shelton signed off on your gas line inspection. But the state database shows a co-signer on that same report. Standard procedure for commercial kitchen gas systems the technician signs, and a state health inspector validates. He paused. I heard his coffee cup set down on the table, untouched and cold. The co-signer was a state health inspector named Nolan Pruitt. The room tilted. Not from the concussion that had faded weeks ago. This was something else. The man in the borrowed lab coat. The man who'd locked my hospital door at midnight and searched my room while pretending to warn me about my daughter. He hadn't just been sent to find something after the explosion. He had certified the weapon before it. Pruitt signed off on a clean gas line 11 days before that same line ruptured and nearly killed me. He validated the work of a technician employed by a shell company linked to Fielding's law firm. Then he showed up in my hospital room searching for evidence while feeding me half-truths about Lorene. He wasn't a messenger. He wasn't a searcher. He was a participant. I thanked Grady and told him to keep everything, every printout, every note on that legal pad, every connection drawn in pencil. I told him to lock his doors again. And I told him I'd call back when I could hold the phone without my hands shaking. It wasn't the burns making them shake. It was the understanding that the conspiracy around my family wasn't a circle. It was a machine, and it had been running for almost a year before I ever smelled the gas. While Grady and I traced the conspiracy backwards through shell companies and co-signed inspections, someone else was tracing it forward, and she didn't even know we existed yet. Jolene Ashby, 27 years old, the youngest branch manager in my chain's history, promoted because she could outwork people twice her age and because her father had driven supply trucks for 22 years before his knees gave out. He taught her one thing about shipping labels that she never forgot. If the weight doesn't match the use, someone's hiding what's really inside. That Tuesday afternoon, Jolene was managing the flagship in my absence when a refrigerated truck backed into the loading bay. The manifest listed food-grade citric acid, sodium benzoate, and phosphoric acid concentrate. All legitimate food additives. All items you might find in a commercial kitchen operation. But the quantities were wrong. Not a little wrong, not rounding error wrong. 400 pounds of citric acid on a single pallet. Our biggest batch of pulled pork uses 11 ounces. Jolene stood in the loading bay, with the manifest in one hand and her phone in the other, doing math that made her sick. She cross-referenced against the chain's master recipe database. 0 matches. Not a single formula in 41 years of operation called for these chemicals at these volumes. When she asked the delivery driver who authorized the order, he pulled a purchase order from his clipboard and held it up. "Ma'am, I just drive where the manifest says. Purchase order's right there, signed by a Lorene Keach. That your boss?" "That's the owner's daughter," Jolene said. "Well, She's been ordering a lot of this stuff. Third run month. Third run this month. Jolene was 27 years old. 3 years into her first management job. Standing in a loading bay, holding a manifest that could destroy a company worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes. Or save it. Her hands were shaking. She took the photograph anyway. She moved through the delivery with professional calm. Nodding at the driver, checking pallet counts, doing everything a branch manager is supposed to do during a receiving inspection. But behind each nod, her phone clicked once for the manifest, once for the purchase order, once for the shipping label on each drum. She stored every image in a locked folder on her personal phone, not the company device. The purchase orders went back 6 weeks. Jolene pulled the records from the office filing cabinet while the kitchen crew ran the dinner service. 6 weeks of chemical deliveries at volumes that had nothing to do with feeding people. Every order signed by Laureen. Every one processed through vendors Jolene had never heard of in 3 years of managing this location. What do you do when the person signing the orders is the owner's daughter? The owner is in a burn unit, and the chemicals in your loading dock could put people in prison. You do what her father would have done. You document everything, and you tell no one until you know who to trust. She photographed 14 documents that afternoon. Then she walked into the walk-in cooler to photograph the last pallet, the one pushed to the back wall behind the brisket racks. The one nobody was supposed to look at closely, and found something the manifests didn't list. The food-grade labels on the drums were peeling at the corners. Not from moisture, from being applied over something else. Jolene pressed her fingernail under the edge of the top label and pulled. Condensation cold against her skin, the adhesive resisting, then giving way. Underneath was a second label, printed in red ink. Hazard diamonds, the kind she'd seen on industrial supply trucks her father used to pass on the highway. A chemical name in block letters that she didn't recognize. She photographed it. Her phone camera clicked in the humming silence of the walk-in, between racks of brisket that smelled like mesquite and a drum that smelled like nothing a kitchen should contain. That night, in her apartment, she loved the word on the hidden label. She typed it into her phone with fingers still cold from the cooler and read the first 3 results. Methylamine, a precursor chemical, controlled. The kind of substance that doesn't show up in restaurant supply chains unless someone is using those chains to move it. Jolene locked her phone and set it face down on her nightstand. 14 photographs, 3 manifests. Purchase orders predating my explosion by 2 full weeks. And a word she wished she'd never had to learn. Hidden underneath a label designed to make poison look like pantry stock. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did I. 40 miles south in the burn unit, fighting a battle no photograph could help me with. The battle against hoping my daughter was still the woman I'd raised. I was losing that fight. And the evidence hadn't even finished arriving. I didn't know about the methylamine yet. That would come later. From a 27-year-old branch manager with more courage than anyone twice her age. What I had that night, the night after my first skin graft, was silence. And a list of facts I could no longer rearrange into innocence. The second surgery hurt less than the first. Not because the grafts were smaller, but because I'd learned that physical pain was the only honest thing left in that hospital room. The iodine stung. The surgical tape pulled. The new skin on my forearm stretched tight every time I shifted. All of it was real. All of it told the truth. Nothing else around me did. I lay in the pre-dawn dark of room 314 and did something I'd been avoiding since the night Harlan called. I built my daughter's defense. Maybe she didn't know about the gas line. Maybe Fielding had forged her codes. The shell company was coincidence. The whispered phone call was about something else entirely. I tried every bridge, every version of the story where Laureen was still the girl who'd grabbed my arm at Eleanor's funeral and swore she'd never let the chain leave the family. Every bridge led back to the same side of the river. You want to know what breaks a 70-year-old man? Not broken ribs, not burned skin. It's lying in a hospital bed at 3 in the morning. Running out of reasons to believe your only child didn't put you there. 16 invoices bearing her code. Fake vendors created the day after my explosion. A voice on a phone call that belonged to a woman, afraid of the person she worked for. None of it was ambiguous. No matter how many bridges I tried to build. Denial is a smokehouse door. It keeps the heat in and the truth out. Eventually the wood warps and the seal cracks. So I made a choice. Not between loving her and suspecting her. A father can do both at once. The choice was simpler, knowing or hoping. I chose knowing. I drank lukewarm water from a plastic cup flat. Tasteless, the flavor of decisions made in the dark, and I picked up the burner phone. Its plastic casing was warm from being gripped all night. The screen said 5:47 a.m. Before the nurse's shift change. Before Lorraine's morning visit. Before the sun reached my window. I dialed Grady. He answered on the second ring. I could hear hill country whine through his kitchen window and the creak of a chair that had been sat in all night. "I need you to come to Austin," I said. "Bring everything you found. And call Harlan. Tell him to bring the invoices, all 16. Grady didn't ask why. He didn't ask if I was sure. He'd known me long enough to hear the difference between a man asking a question and a man who'd finished asking them. "We're not guessing anymore, Grady. We're building a case." I set the phone down and watched the blue pre-dawn light edge through the blinds, casting thin lines across the bedsheet. In 2 hours, Lorraine would walk through that door with a smile and a kiss and a progress report on the chain I'd built. And I would smile back. And I would listen. And for the first time in 40 years, I would not believe a word my daughter said. Lorraine visited that morning. I smiled. I told her the grafts were healing well. She kissed my forehead and left a brisket sandwich I wouldn't eat. 2 hours after she drove away. Grady walked through the same door, carrying a duffel bag full of printed records. And Harlan came 3 steps behind him with a locked briefcase. 2 men who had never met, walking into a burn unit to take apart a conspiracy over a hospital tray table. Grady smelled like hill country cedar. It clung to the leather of his duffel and filled the sterile room like something alive. Harlan's briefcase locks clicked open with the precision of a man who'd been waiting to show someone what was inside. They spread their findings across the tray table, and I traced the printouts with healing fingers that could feel the raised ink of my daughter's authorization codes on every page. Harlan went first. His 16 invoices, the fake vendors, the redirected payments, the routing numbers that connected to a bank nobody in my company had ever used. He laid them out in chronological order, each one dated and coded. Then Grady placed his records alongside. The shell company filings, the gas technician's employment history, the inspection co-signature, the shipping logs he'd pulled from state databases through contacts who still owed him favors. They matched. Shipment by shipment, date by date. Harlan's money trail and Grady's supply chain records locked together like teeth in a zipper. What emerged wasn't what I'd imagined. It was worse. 30 shipments. 14 months. Restricted chemicals relabeled as food-grade additives, the same kind Jolene would later tell me she'd found in the walk-in cooler, routed through my own refrigerated trucks, past highway patrol, past federal checkpoints, through loading docks that bore my name. Estimated street value of the precursors, $4.2 million. My trucks, my name, my daughter's signature on every purchase order. I sat with that number, while Grady's hand-drawn timeline yellow legal pad, pencil lines connecting dates to shipments, filled in the gaps my mind had been leaving empty. This wasn't a scheme that started with my explosion. The first shipment was logged 14 months before the fire. Someone had been running this operation through my company for over a year while I smoked brisket and signed payroll and believed the world made sense. What kind of man builds a 14-month smuggling operation inside a family restaurant chain and then blows up the owner to finish the job? Not a desperate man, a patient one. And I had met exactly one patient man in all of this. A man in a linen shirt, who once offered to buy my chain for nearly half what it was worth and smiled when I said no. The money trail dead ends at a Delaware LLC called Ridgeline Holdings, Harlan said, tapping a printout with his pen. No officers listed. No public filings beyond the articles of incorporation. Whoever owns Ridgeline owns everything: the maintenance company, the fake vendors, and the payment that cleared your daughter's medical debt. One LLC. One name hiding behind a wall of Delaware incorporation law. Every thread we'd pulled. The explosion, the invoices, the chemicals, the hospital intrusion ran through the same needle. So we know what? I said. We know how. We know how long. But we don't know who. Not yet, Grady said. He folded his reading glasses and set them on the legal pad. But Delaware LLCs have beneficial owners on file with the state. I've got a contact who can pull it. Retired IRS. Owes me from the 90s. Give me 48 hours. I looked at both of them. Harlan with his briefcase and his quiet courage. Grady with his favors and his penciled timelines, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Eleanor died. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Certainty that I wasn't alone. We shared vending machine coffee. Bitter. Burnt. Served in paper cups that bent when you gripped them. We deserved better. But we drank it standing around a hospital tray table covered in evidence of a crime that had used my life's work as camouflage. And nobody complained. Grady packed his duffel. Harlan locked his briefcase. Before they left, Grady stopped at the door and looked at me with an expression I recognized. The face of a man who had already run ahead to the answer and didn't like what he found there. Vernon, I'll pull the Ridgeline ownership, but prepare yourself. That LLC was registered 8 days after you turned down Fielding's buyout offer. Whatever this is, it didn't start with the explosion. It started the day you told Breck Fielding no. The door closed. I sat alone with 30 shipments mapped on a legal pad and a name I didn't have yet. 48 hours. Grady would call back with the name on the Ridgeline filing. And when he did, the last wall between me and the truth would come down, whether I was ready for what was behind it or not. Grady had promised 48 hours. He called back in 31. And the silence before he spoke told me everything the words were about to confirm. I was sitting up in bed, morning light catching dust particles above the tray table where the evidence printouts had been spread hours before. I'd cleared them away for Lorene's expected afternoon visit, the routine I now maintained like an actor running the same scene every day. Fresh bandage adhesive from the morning dressing change stung my forearms. The nurses kept their schedule. The world kept collapsing. Both things happened at the same time. Vernon. Grady's voice had flattened into the register of a man delivering a death notification. I'd heard that tone from doctors, from police chaplains, from the funeral director who'd handled Eleanor. I knew what it meant before the next sentence landed. The beneficial owner of Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, is the Lorene Keach Irrevocable Trust, established 6 years ago, almost to the week. 8 days after I'd rejected Fielding's buyout. Vernon, it's her name. Not Fielding's. Hers. I pressed my hand flat against the mattress as if steadying myself against a fall that was entirely internal. My mouth went dry, tongue stuck to the roof, the body forgetting how to swallow while the mind processed something it had been built to reject. 1 minute. I sat there for 1 full minute without saying a word. 60 seconds of dead air on a burner phone. The heart monitor beeping its indifferent rhythm. The room shrinking around me until there was nothing in it but the sound of my own breathing, and a truth I could no longer outrun. My daughter's name. On the ownership line. Not as a victim, not as a pawn, as the legal beneficiary of every fake vendor, every chemical shipment, every dollar that had been drained from the company I'd built, with her mother's recipes in my own hands. I named her Lorene, after Eleanor. The same letters rearranged. The way a daughter is supposed to be, A rearrangement of her mother, something familiar made new. Not something familiar made into a weapon. The minute ended. When I spoke again, my voice belonged to someone I didn't recognize. Someone colder. Someone who had buried a father somewhere inside that silence and let an investigator climb out in his place. An irrevocable trust means someone else set it up for her, I said. She can't dissolve it. She can't walk away from it, even if she wanted to. Find out which attorney filed the trust documents. And find out if Fielding paid them. Grady exhaled. I could hear him writing the scratch of pencil on that same yellow legal pad. You're thinking she was locked in. I'm thinking a 38-year-old woman running a restaurant chain doesn't set up a company that exists only on paper, and a legal trap that couldn't be undone all by herself. Someone built this structure around her, and whoever built it made sure she couldn't get out. You think the worst thing a parent can learn is that their child is in danger? The worst thing is learning your child is the danger and that someone else made her that way while you weren't looking. The NICU debt. The timing. A baby on a ventilator and a bill that could bury a young mother. Arriving at the exact moment a rejected investor needed someone inside my company. It wasn't coincidence. It was recruitment. And that legal trap was the lock that kept the recruit from quitting. Grady, one more thing. The trust was established 6 years before the explosion. The NICU crisis came 5 years after that, 5 months before the fire. Whatever Fielding used to bring her in the first time, it wasn't the baby. The baby came later. The debt came later. He had her before that. Then what was the original hook? I looked at the recipe box on the shelf. Eleanor's box. Lorene's name on a trust filed the same month Eleanor would have turned 63. My daughter had been 20 when her mother died. Alone with a father who taught her the business, but never taught her what the business cost. A young woman with a chain she'd sworn to protect, and no one to tell her the difference between protecting and being used. Grief, I said. He used her grief. The same way he'll try to use mine. I hung up and stared at that box until the light in the room shifted from morning to midday. An irrevocable trust needs a grantor. A conspiracy needs an architect. And a father who has lost his ability to hope needs one thing more than evidence. He needs to understand the exact moment his daughter stopped being his daughter and started being someone else's instrument. That moment was 6 years ago, and the man who engineered it had sat in my hospital room with a gift basket and a smile, talking about steady hands. 6 years is a long time to hold a grudge, unless you're the kind of man who calls it an investment. I spent that night reconstructing the timeline, working backwards from Lorene's name on the Ridgeline Trust to the afternoon it all started. 6 years earlier. The day I told Breck Fielding no. He'd walked into the flagship on a Wednesday during the lunch rush. The kitchen was running full mesquite smoke pouring from the exhaust vents, every table full. The staff moving with the rhythm of people who'd been doing this together for years. Fielding set a folder on the counter and smiled at me the way a man smiles at something he's already decided to own. 33 million. Vernon, clean deal. You keep the name, I keep the trucks, the locations, and the supply contracts. You retire a wealthy man. I didn't open the folder. Didn't need to. My chain was worth nearly twice that, and he knew it. The offer wasn't business. It was a test. The kind a man runs to see if the person across the counter is tired enough, old enough, or vain enough to take the first number on the table. I'm already a wealthy man. Breck, I said. I just don't dress like one. The staff behind me laughed. A couple of them applauded. Fielding straightened his cuffs, that same gesture I'd see again in my hospital room years later, and walked toward the door. Offers don't expire, Vernon, he said. Neither does patience. I should have heard it for what it was. Not a business platitude, but a promise. The kind a patient man makes when he's already decided how the story ends. I never told Lorene about the buyout. I thought I was protecting her from a business problem. Instead, I left her defenseless against the man who created it. 5 years passed. Fielding disappeared from my radar. I didn't know that he'd spent those years watching, waiting, mapping my family the way Grady mapped shell companies looking for the crack in the foundation. And when Loreen's baby arrived premature 5 months before the explosion, when the NICU bills started climbing toward a number no young mother could carry alone, Fielding found his opening. He didn't approach her with a contract. He approached her with a check. The full amount paid through something called the Ridgeline Community Foundation, a charitable entity that Grady's contact confirmed was dissolved 6 months after the single transaction it was built to execute. It existed for one purpose: to create an obligation my daughter could never repay with money. What mother says no to that? What mother, sitting beside an incubator, watching her baby breathe through a machine, asks where the check comes from? Loreen didn't ask. She took the help because the alternative was watching her daughter die with a billing department on the phone. Fielding didn't break down the door. He paid for the key. And the locksmith was a hospital billing department that charged a mother a fortune to save her baby's life. Within weeks, Loreen was attending meetings at Fielding Capital Partners in the Domain. I reconstructed this from Harlan's calendar entries and Grady's timeline 3 visits that first month. Then weekly within a few weeks. Within months, she had signed trust documents that locked her into a legal structure she likely didn't fully understand. A trap on paper. A company that existed only to hide who really owned it. And vendor accounts that would be activated the moment I was out of the way. Fielding didn't buy my daughter. He rescued her, and then he owned the debt. That's not corruption, that's architecture. The same patience he showed me at the flagship counter applied to someone who didn't have 40 years of armor to see it coming. I clenched the hospital blanket until my knuckles went white beneath healing skin and did the math one more time. 6 years before the fire, buyout rejected. Ridgeline Holdings filed 8 days later. 5 months before the fire NICU crisis, the foundation pays the bill. Months later, Loreen signs the trust documents. Chemical shipments begin within months. This spring, the gas line explodes with me standing next to it. Every move separated by exactly the amount of time needed to make the next one invisible. Patient, methodical. 6 years from rejection to detonation. And now I understood the final move, the one Fielding hadn't made yet. If I was declared mentally incompetent, Loreen would inherit the chain under the power of attorney she'd already had me sign. And if Loreen was controlled by Fielding through that legal trap, then Fielding would own everything I'd built without ever putting his signature on a single page. The guardianship petition. That was the last piece. The one legal instrument that would end me without another explosion, without another fire, without anything louder than a judge's signature. I picked up the burner phone and called the only attorney I trusted. Because the petition was coming. I could feel it. The way you feel weather changing. Not in the sky, but in the pressure behind your eyes. The attorney I called was Petra Dunlap. But her part in this comes later. What came first, the very next morning, was Harlan. He called at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, which meant he had been up all night. In 20 years of knowing Harlan Odom, I had never once known him to lose sleep over numbers that added up. When numbers kept him awake, it was because they told a story he couldn't unread. Vernon, I found something. Loreen forgot to unsync her personal email from the company's shared drive. I sat up in bed. The pre-dawn light was turning the ceiling gray, and the recipe box sat on the shelf where it always sat, watching over me like something Eleanor had left behind to keep guard. What did you find? An email from a Fielding Capital address, sent to Loreen in January this year. Harlan's voice was careful, each word measured, the way a man speaks when he knows the next sentence will change the person hearing it. I'm going to read it to you exactly as written. I gripped the burner phone against my ear, its cracked screen warm from a night of charging, and listened. If you step back now, the shipping records will be restructured to show your father authorized every shipment. He will be the one indicted, not you, not me, him. The room contracted. The heart monitor beeped. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic, the permanent atmosphere of a man who hadn't left a hospital room in 4 weeks, closed around me like a fist. She wasn't choosing Fielding over me. She was choosing me over herself. And the cruelty of it was that she thought silence was the same thing as love. I ran my thumb across the worn wood grain of the recipe box and felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage at my daughter, but rage for her. The same fury, redirected. Because the email changed everything I thought I understood. Lorene hadn't signed those trust documents out of greed. She hadn't filed those purchase orders because Fielding promised her wealth. She had done it because a man with patience and resources had told her explicitly, in writing, that if she stopped cooperating, her father would be framed for federal crimes and spend his last years in prison. My daughter wasn't the villain. She was the hostage. And the ransom was me. Harlan kept talking. He'd traced the full life cycle of the NICU payment from the dissolved foundation through the bank account at Lone Star National, back to a funding source that matched the same routing numbers behind every fake vendor in our system. One pipeline, one architect. Every dollar Fielding used to trap Lorene came from the same machine that was draining my company. Harlan, can you copy that email without Lorene knowing? Already done. It's on a flash drive in my locked desk. A pause. Vernon, she's not the villain here. She's the hostage. I know. What do you do when you learn your daughter betrayed you to save you? When the reason she couldn't tell you the truth is because the truth would have put you in prison instead of her. You sit in a hospital bed at dawn with salt on your lip from tears you didn't realize had started, and you rebuild every assumption you've made in the last 4 weeks. Every cold thought, every hardened resolve, every moment you looked at her and saw a stranger. She was never a stranger. She was a mother and a daughter caught between 2 debts she couldn't pay. One to a hospital and one to a predator. And she'd chosen the option that kept her father alive and her baby breathing, even though it meant losing herself. I held the recipe box against my chest and breathed until my ribs stopped shaking. Then Harlan said the thing that ended the breathing. Vernon, there's a guardianship petition being drafted. My source at the courthouse says it's already been assigned a case number. It hasn't been filed yet, but it's in the system. You have days, not weeks. Guardianship, the word I'd predicted. The final move in Fielding's 6-year sequence. Declare me incompetent. Transfer authority to Lorene. Control Lorene through the trust. Own the chain without a signature. And the petition would need a medical opinion. A doctor's assessment that I was cognitively unfit to manage my own affairs. A doctor who had treated me since the night of the explosion. A doctor who never asked how the fire started. Callister. I set the recipe box down on the tray table, wiped my face with the back of my bandaged hand, and picked up the burner phone again. Harlan. I need a lawyer. Not a business lawyer. An elder protection attorney, someone who fights guardianship petitions for a living. And I need them before that filing hits the judge's desk. Harlan found the attorney. But the petition found me first. Lorene brought the guardianship papers herself. She walked in on a Thursday morning, set the filing on my tray table next to a plate of scrambled eggs, and sat down as if court documents and breakfast belonged in the same conversation. Daddy? It's temporary, she said. Her voice cracked on the word love before she even got to it. Dr. Callister says the medication might be affecting your judgment. This just protects the company until you're strong enough to come back. I wouldn't do this if I didn't love you. She said she loved me with the same mouth that had whispered into a phone she thought I couldn't hear. And the worst part, I believed both things were true. My daughter loved me. And my daughter was destroying me. And she was doing both at the same time, because a man in a linen shirt had convinced her there was no other way. I picked up the filing. Cream-colored paper, heavy stock. the kind of paper that carries weight in courtrooms. The petition for emergency guardianship over Vernon Keach, filed in Travis County. Attached was a 4-page cognitive assessment signed by Dr. Reed Callister in blue ink at the bottom of every page. I read every word. Progressive disorientation, impaired executive function, medication-induced confabulatory episodes. I could recite that report from memory right now, which is an interesting thing for a man with impaired executive function to be able to do. Callister's assessment was precise. Too precise. The language wasn't medical shorthand, dashed off between rounds. It was crafted, polished, built to survive cross-examination. Phrases like diminished capacity to manage complex financial decisions and episodic inability to distinguish current events from historical recall read like they'd been written by a lawyer, not a doctor. Someone had coached Callister on exactly what a guardianship judge needs to see. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. 21 days. I looked at Lorene across the tray table. She was watching my face the way a child watches a parent read a report card, afraid of the reaction. Already rehearsing an excuse. Her perfume drifted across the space between us. Jasmine. The same scent Eleanor used to wear. Whether she chose it deliberately or by habit, it landed on me like a knife. I understood the trap. If I protested, raised my voice, challenged the diagnosis, demanded to see another doctor, Callister's report already had the answer. Patient exhibits agitation and paranoid ideation when confronted with medical assessments, consistent with cognitive decline. Any resistance I showed would become evidence against me. The petition was a box designed so that fighting it proved it right. So I didn't fight. "I'll read it over, sweetheart," I said. "You're right, it's probably for the best." I watched her shoulders drop with relief. Her eyes softened. She reached across the tray table and squeezed my hand. My healing hand. The new skin tight across the knuckles, and I squeezed back. 2 people, performing love across a document designed to end one of them. She needed me to agree because the alternative was force. And she wasn't ready for that yet, which meant she was still in there, still my daughter. Somewhere underneath the fear and the debt and the threats, the woman who had grabbed my arm at Eleanor's funeral was still alive inside the woman sitting across from me. That was the thing I held on to while I smiled and pretended to accept my own dismantling. You want to know the cruelest part of a guardianship petition? It turns love into evidence. Every time your daughter visits, every time she holds your hand, every concerned phone call to the nurse's station, it becomes proof that she cares enough to protect you from yourself. The very things that make her your daughter make her the perfect petitioner. Lorene left at noon. Her Jasmine lingered after the door closed. I pushed the scrambled eggs aside cold, untouched. The metallic aftertaste of swallowed rage sitting where breakfast should have been, and folded the petition carefully. I slid it under Eleanor's recipe box on the shelf. The paper edges were sharp against my new skin. I let them cut. 3 weeks. 21 days before a judge in Travis County could declare me incompetent and hand my life's work to the daughter Fielding controlled. 3 weeks to build a case, find a lawyer who could dismantle a fraudulent medical report, and do it all from a hospital bed with burned arms and a burner phone. I picked up the phone and dialed Grady. "I need a lawyer," I said. "Not a good one. The best one. Someone who fights guardianship fraud for a living, and I need them in this room before the weekend." Grady didn't hesitate. "I know exactly who to call." Grady found the lawyer in 48 hours. She walked into my hospital room on a Friday afternoon and changed the math on everything. Petra Dunlap, 49 years old, elder rights attorney out of San Antonio, who had blocked more fraudulent conservatorships than she could count. She carried a manila folder and no smile. She shook my bandaged hand once, firmly. The first handshake in weeks that felt like an alliance instead of a performance, sat down in the bedside chair, and said, "Show me the petition," before Grady had finished introducing her. I pulled the filing from under Eleanor's recipe box and handed it over. Petra read Callister's cognitive assessment the way I read a gas bill fast. Clinical. Looking for the number that didn't belong. 90 seconds. That's how long it took her. 3 problems, she said, her red pen already moving. Her voice was flat and precise. No inflection wasted on empathy when competence was what the room needed. First, no guardian ad litem was present during the evaluation. That's mandatory under Texas Estates Code 1101. Second, the slums and MOCA tests cited here are contraindicated for patients on opioid pain protocols. Any neurologist will testify to that. Third, Dr. Callister doesn't disclose any financial relationship with the petitioner or related parties. If I find one, this report isn't just flawed, it's fraud. You'll find one, I said. $150,000 worth. Petra didn't blink. She wrote the number in the margin of the petition and circled it in red ink. Then she pulled out her phone. Petra Dunlap didn't practice law the way most lawyers do. She practiced it the way a surgeon removes a tumor. No wasted motion, no sentiment, and absolute certainty about where to cut. In the time it took Grady to pour himself a cup of vending machine coffee, she had drafted a counter-motion demanding an independent medical evaluation by a physician with no ties to any party. Formatted it and e-filed it from her phone. The confirmation appeared on her screen before she put the phone away. "How much time does the counter-motion buy us?" Grady asked. "The independent evaluation takes 3 to 4 weeks to schedule. Add the mandatory review period. You went from 3 weeks to 6. Use them." Before I tell you what Petra said next, the detail that changes who the real target becomes, drop your guess in one sentence. Who do you think ends up facing charges? First. Please note, some details ahead are adapted for storytelling to deepen the emotional impact. The message behind them is what matters. 6 weeks. That's what one lawyer with a manila folder and a phone bought me 6 weeks to do what Fielding had spent 6 years planning to prevent. For the first time since the explosion, the clock was running in my direction. I could feel it the way you feel a current shift in a river, not in the water, but in the way the debris starts moving. Petra gathered her folder and stood. She paused at the doorway, the same doorway Fielding had paused in weeks ago, the same one Pruitt had slipped through at midnight. But where they had lingered to manipulate, she lingered to arm me. "Mr. Keech, one more thing." She turned, and her eyes were the coldest, steady thing I'd seen since I woke up in this room. "If we can prove Callister was paid to write that report, the guardianship petition doesn't just get dismissed. It becomes evidence of conspiracy to commit elder abuse. That's a felony in Texas." She let that land. "Your daughter filed the petition. But the question that matters in court isn't who filed it, it's who told her to." She left. The smell of leather and fresh printer paper faded behind her, replaced by the permanent antiseptic that had been my atmosphere for 5 weeks. I looked at Grady. He was holding his coffee cup with both hands. And for the first time since this started, the man was almost smiling. 6 weeks, I said. "And we need every hour of them." Grady nodded. "Harlan's already pulling payment records for Callister. If there's a wire transfer, he'll find it." I looked at the recipe box on the shelf. The petition was no longer underneath it. Petra had taken it with her, along with Callister's report. Both now weapons in her hands instead of weapons aimed at mine. The box sat alone on the shelf, the way it had since the paramedics placed it there the night of the fire. Cedar, brass latch. Er's handwriting on the index cards inside. I reached over and touched it. Not to open it, just to feel the wood under my fingers and remember that some things survive fires and frauds and daughters who love you enough to destroy you. The counterattack had begun. Proving the bribe was the easy part. The hard part was learning how cheap my life had been. Petra's countermotion had bought me 6 weeks. Harlan and Grady spent the first of them turning Fielding's financial architecture inside out. And what they found was a payroll clean. Methodical. Every payment routed through the same Fielding subsidiary, like a company cutting monthly checks to contractors. Money has a memory. Every dollar remembers where it came from, and Harlan had spent 20 years reading those memories in ledger lines and routing numbers. He called me on a Tuesday with a laptop propped against my bed rail, spreadsheet columns highlighted in yellow. "Ridgeline Asset Management," he said. Another Fielding shell. He'd wired $150,000 to a Cayman Islands account on May 4th. Dr. Callister's medical board disclosure lists that same account as a personal investment holding. He signed the cognitive report on May 7th. 3 days. 3 days between the payment and the signature. $150,000 to write 4 pages of lies about a man he was supposed to be healing. Callister had looked me in the eye every morning for 5 weeks. Changed my dressings, checked my graft sites, adjusted my pain medication with steady hands and a calm voice. And the whole time he was being paid more than most of my employees make in 3 years to declare me incompetent. I wasn't even the expensive part of the plan. Less than a quarter of what Fielding had spent on the NICU payment. Less than 0.5% of what the chain was worth. He didn't even have to lie well, Harlan said. The report just had to survive long enough to get a case number. I wrote the number on my notepad. The pen shook between healing fingers. But the handwriting was legible. It grew steadier with every page. Then Grady called from the ranch. I could hear his drawl slowing down the way it always did when the numbers were about to hurt. 18 payments. Vernon. $6,667 a month for 18 months. Same source, Ridgeline Asset Management. Same Cayman pipeline. Pruitt. The state inspector who had co-signed the gas line inspection. The man who had searched my hospital room at midnight in a borrowed lab coat. $120,000. Parceled out in monthly installments the way you'd pay a retainer. Because that's what he was, a retainer, an employee. Fielding didn't build a conspiracy. He built a payroll. Every person who touched my life in that hospital had a price tag attached by the same hand. Paid from the same account. For the same purpose. To make me disappear without anyone having to pull a trigger. But here's the part that matters, Grady said. Pruitt didn't just break into your room. He co-signed the first fraudulent food safety certificate that allowed chemical shipments to move through your trucks. 14 months before the explosion. He was the gatekeeper. Vernon. Without his signature, nothing moved. The room smelled like stale recycled air. Weeks of closed-door conversations had turned my hospital room into something between a war room and a prison cell. I looked at the notepad beside Eleanor's recipe box. My handwriting filled 3 pages now. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Connections drawn in pencil, the way Grady drew them on his yellow legal pad. 2 men, 2 price tags. The doctor who lied about my mind, and the inspector who certified the poison. Both checks signed by the same ghost company, with Fielding's fingerprints on the letterhead. I thanked Harlan. I thanked Grady. They'd given me the full financial anatomy of the conspiracy. Every wire, every shell, every payment that connected Breck Fielding to the explosion, the fraud. The chemicals, and the guardianship petition designed to finish what the fire started. But I was a 70-year-old man in a burn unit with a burner phone and a recipe box. I had the evidence. I had the lawyer. I had 2 allies who'd risked everything to help me. What I didn't have was a badge. I picked up the phone one more time. My fingers were steady now the grafts had healed enough that I could grip without wincing, dial without fumbling. The notepad sat open beside me. 3 pages of proof written in a hand that was supposed to be too impaired to manage its own affairs. Grady, I said, I need you to make one more call. Not a lawyer, not an accountant. I need a federal agent, someone at the FBI field office in San Antonio. Someone who handles financial crimes and doesn't owe favors to anyone in Austin. A pause. Then Grady's voice, quiet and certain. I know a name. Give me 24 hours. The case was leaving my hospital room. It was time to hand it to someone who could finish it. Grady made the call. 24 hours later. The most dangerous person to walk into my hospital room since Nolan Pruitt sat down in the visitor chair and didn't say a word for 40 minutes. Special Agent Colton Voss, 41 years old, FBI, San Antonio Field Office, Financial Crimes Division. He arrived in a rental sedan with no insignia, wearing a gray suit that looked like it had been chosen to be forgotten. He shook my hand, sat down, placed his palms flat on his knees and said, "Start from the beginning, Mr. Keach. Don't skip anything." So I told him. Everything. The explosion, the sabotaged gas coupling, Fielding arriving at my bedside with foreknowledge no outsider should have, Lorraine's pre-printed documents, the whispered phone call, the midnight intrusion, Harlan's fake invoices, Grady's shell companies, the irrevocable trust, the dissolved foundation, the coercion email, the bribed doctor, the bribed inspector, the guardianship petition designed to strip me of everything I'd built. Voss listened the way a recording device listens, without expression, without interruption, without a single unnecessary movement. His voice, when he finally used it, had the even cadence of a man who testifies for a living and never wastes a syllable. He reviewed Harlan's financial documents. He studied Grady's supply chain records. He read the coercion email twice. Then he looked up from the tray table and delivered his assessment the way a contractor delivers a bid. Precise, unemotional, structural. "Mr. Keach, I've been doing commercial fraud for 11 years. This isn't fraud. This is a hostile acquisition disguised as a criminal enterprise. You spend 8 weeks investigating your own daughter from a hospital bed, and you start to wonder if you've lost your mind. If the burns and the medication and the grief have turned you into a paranoid old man chasing shadows through ledger lines, then a federal agent sits in your visitor chair and says the word indictment, and the shadows become walls. Chemical diversion under the Controlled Substances Act," Voss said, counting on his fingers. "Wire fraud through the fake vendor network. Conspiracy to commit elder abuse across state lines via the guardianship petition. Money laundering through the shell companies. 4 federal charges minimum. Possibly more depending on what the grand jury sees. 4 charges. I'd spent weeks building a case I was afraid might be delusion. Voss turned it into a federal prosecution in the time it took to count to 4. But I need 2 things to make it airtight," he said. "First, a cooperating insider from Fielding's operation. Someone who was inside the machine and can testify to how it worked. Second, a formal whistleblower filing on the chemical shipments, someone with first-hand knowledge, who saw the product, touched the labels, and can put it on the record." I thought of Pruitt, the inspector whose monthly payments Grady had traced, the man who had certified the gas line and the chemical shipments and then searched my hospital room looking for evidence he could destroy. "The inside man," I said. "Would a state health inspector who's been on the payroll for 18 months and is about to realize his employer considers him disposable, would that work for you? How do you explain to an FBI agent that the man you want arrested once sat in this same chair with a gift basket? That the woman who filed the petition to take your life away is the same woman whose baby pictures are taped to your heart monitor? You don't explain it. You hand over the documents and let the numbers do the talking." That's what Voss understood. Numbers don't grieve. Numbers don't forgive. Numbers just point. Voss didn't promise justice. He didn't promise it would be easy or clean or fast. He promised procedure. And after 8 weeks of watching people lie to me from every direction, procedure was the most beautiful word I'd ever heard. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and paused at the door. The same doorway everyone paused in Fielding, Pruitt, Petra. But Voss paused for a different reason. He had one more piece of information, and he'd been holding it since he walked in. "Mr. Keach, one more thing. You mentioned a state inspector named Pruitt, the one who entered your room. We've been watching him for 6 months on an unrelated food safety corruption case out of Houston. He doesn't know it yet. Voss adjusted his jacket. A faint smell of rental car air freshener drifted from the fabric. 48 hours ago, our surveillance flagged a text message sent to Pruitt's personal phone from a number registered to Fielding Capital Partners. 2 words. He looked at me. Clean up. The room was silent. The heart monitor beeped. In my experience, Voss said, that's the moment a man like Pruitt starts looking for the nearest exit. And I intend to be standing in front of it. He left. I sat alone with the taste of clarity, sharp, metallic, the flavor of a decision that cannot be unmade. The case was no longer mine. It belonged to the federal government now. And the federal government didn't run on grief. It ran on evidence. I had given them plenty. Pruitt didn't make it a week. Fielding's 2-word text, the one the FBI had already intercepted, did what 8 weeks of my investigation couldn't. It broke the weakest link in the chain and sent him running. Nolan Pruitt walked into the FBI's San Antonio field office on a Tuesday morning, carrying a shoebox full of burner phones. Voss told me later that the man's hands were shaking so hard, the phones rattled against each other like bones in a box. He sat down in the interview room, placed the shoebox on the table, and said he wanted to talk to whoever handled chemical cases. Voss was already seated across from him. Pruitt confessed everything. The monthly payments he'd collected for 18 months. The forged food safety certificates that opened the smuggling pipeline through my trucks. The hospital intrusion, which, it turned out, wasn't just about intimidation. Fielding had sent him to find a USB drive. He believed I possessed a backup of the company's financial records that predated Laureen's vendor changes records that would expose every fake invoice from day one. Pruitt had searched my bedside drawer, under the mattress, behind the IV stand, and his last glance had landed on the recipe box. Because Fielding had told him to check anything the old man brought from home. There was no USB drive. But the recipe box would carry something far more damaging before this was over. Clean up. 2 words in a text message. That's all it took to turn an 18-month co-conspirator into a cooperating witness with a shoebox full of evidence. Fielding's greatest weapon had always been patience. But patience had finally created the one thing it can't fix a man with nothing left to lose. I spent 17 years believing I was a good man who hadn't been tested yet. Pruitt told Voss. His voice cracked on the word that came next. Turns out I was tested a 1.5 years ago and I failed. $6,000 a month. That was my price. Voss didn't blink. Mr. Pruitt, I'm not interested in your conscience. I'm interested in your recordings. Pruitt slid the shoebox across the table. 3 recorded phone calls. Fielding's voice on all of them, naming shipments, routing numbers, and me by name. Physical evidence. Federal evidence. The kind that doesn't need a hospital bed to be credible. Pruitt didn't flip because he was brave. He flipped because Fielding made him more afraid of staying than leaving. In the end, the man who broke into my hospital room saved the case, not out of honor, but out of the same self-preservation that put him there in the first place. I'll take it. But Pruitt was only half of what Voss needed. The other half drove 80 miles from Round Rock to San Antonio that same afternoon. Jolene Ashby walked into the same field office carrying her personal phone locked in her hand like a weapon she'd been waiting 6 weeks to fire. She didn't know Pruitt had been there that morning. She didn't know the FBI already had recordings. She only knew that Grady Polston had called her the night before and told her there was a man in San Antonio who would listen. Jolene was 27 years old. She made $11 more an hour than the line cooks. And she was about to do what a conspiracy built on millions couldn't prevent. She placed her phone on the table and unlocked it for the last time. 14 photographs, 3 delivery manifests, 6 weeks of shipping labels. Audio recordings of conversations where she'd been pressured to sign for chemical deliveries disguised as pantry stock. Voss placed the phone into an evidence bag, while Jolene sat with her hands folded and her mouth set in the thin line of someone who had stopped being afraid the moment she opened the car door. "I understand that those shipments went through trucks with my boss's name on them," she told Voss. "I signed for 3 of them before I realized what I was doing. Protection would be nice, but stopping it is the point." 27 years old. Her father would have been proud. I know I was. Voss called me that evening. I could hear the government building hum behind his voice, carpet cleaner and coffee, and the neutral processing of institutional machinery. "We have everything," he said. "Pruitt's recordings, Ashby's documentation, your financial evidence, Polston's supply chain map. I'm requesting arrest warrants tonight." A beat of silence. "Mr. Keach, when is your Father's Day gala?" I looked at the calendar taped to my IV stand. 8 days. "Why?" "Because if Laureen plans to announce your retirement at that event, I'd like to be there when she does." Another pause. "And I'd like you to be there first." 8 days. That's what Voss had given me. I used them to heal enough to walk, to sign discharge papers, and to turn my wife's recipe box into something Eleanor never imagined. The burn unit discharge nurse handed me a plastic bag labeled Personal Effects. Inside it, folded and sealed in a hospital-issue Ziploc, was my old barbecue apron. I held it to my face before I opened the bag. Through the plastic, through 8 weeks of storage, through everything, it still smelled like mesquite. 40 years of smoke embedded in fabric the way 40 years of marriage embeds itself in bone. You can wash it. You can burn it. You can't get it out. I dressed slowly. Button-down shirt. Careful over the grafted skin on my forearms, still pink, still tight, still tender where the new skin met the old. Khaki pants that hung looser than they should have. I'd lost 19 pounds in Del Seaton. 70 years old, and I looked it for the first time. Then I reached under the hospital bed and pulled out Eleanor's recipe box. Cedar, hand-sanded, brass latch that stuck in the humidity. It had survived the explosion untouched. Traveled with me to the burn unit and sat on the shelf above my sink for 8 weeks while I turned from a patient into something else entirely. The paramedics had brought it in with my personal effects the night of the fire. Now I opened it and placed inside what I'd spent those 8 weeks gathering photocopied invoices. Wire transfer records, shell company filings, Pruitt's signed statement, and a USB drive Harlan had delivered the day before, containing every piece of digital evidence in a single encrypted file. Eleanor's handwriting was still on the lid, her looping cursive spelling out, "Keach Family Recipes, 1985. Underneath it now sat the proof that the family had tried to destroy itself. I pulled the apron over my shirt and tied it behind my back. My hands shook once, then they stopped. 40 years of smoke had seasoned that apron the way grief seasons a man, slow, invisible, permanent. I'd worn it every Father's Day since Eleanor died. I'd wear it one more time. "Mr. Keach, your ride's here," the nurse said from the doorway. "Tell him I'm walking out the front. I came in on a stretcher. I'm leaving on my feet." The automatic doors whooshed open, and June hit me like a wall. Texas heat on grafted skin for the first time. Cicadas screaming in the live oaks along the parking lot. Sunlight so bright it turned the asphalt into a mirror. I stood there for 5 seconds and let it burn. A different kind of burn. The kind that means you're alive. I called Voss from the car. "I'm out," I said. 8 days was generous. I only need 1. "Warrants are signed," Voss said. "We're coordinating with the Round Rock field team. When you arrive at the gala, we'll be in position." Mr. Keach let her start the speech. Let her get to the announcement. I need it on record. I stopped at a gas station on I-35 and bought the first real cup of coffee I'd had in 8 weeks. Black, burnt, perfect. I drank it in the parking lot with the recipe box on the passenger seat and my apron folded over it like a shroud. And I watched the traffic heading north toward Round Rock. 47 miles to the gala. You ever watch someone rehearse a victory speech for a war they've already lost? That's what Lorene was doing in the back office of my flagship restaurant while I merged onto the highway. I know because Grady told me later. Lorene stood at the manager's desk running through her speech notes while Fielding sat in the corner coaching her phrasing. Grady said she read the line, "Health reasons, grateful transition, family legacy continues, simple," 3 times before Fielding was satisfied. "Perfect," Fielding said. According to Grady, no one argues with a daughter honoring her sick father. The notarized ownership amendments were stacked beside her laptop documents that would give her 60% controlling interest once the board ratified at the gala. Fielding had told her it would be done before dessert. Lorene checked her phone. "Has anyone heard from Dad today?" Grady told me she asked it twice. Fielding didn't look up. Grady said, "He's still in that hospital bed. Relax." 3 hours earlier. I had walked out of that hospital bed, through the automatic doors, into the Texas heat, when my dead wife's apron, and carrying a recipe box full of evidence that would end both their careers and send at least one of them to federal prison. Lorene set down her speech notes and smiled. "By tomorrow night, this is all mine." 47 miles south on I-35, I changed lanes, set my coffee in the cup holder, and drove north toward the only home I had left. The recipe box rode beside me. Voss's number glowed on my phone screen. She didn't know I was coming. The string lights over the smokehouse patio caught the grease smoke haze and turned it gold. 300 guests sat at long tables under that amber glow. Plates of brisket and cornbread, and Eleanor's pecan pie glaze laid out the way I'd laid them out every Father's Day for 20 years. The applause started before Lorene even reached the microphone. She looked beautiful. She looked like her mother. She stood at the podium in a navy dress with the Keach's Smokehouse logo pinned to her lapel. And she began to speak about family, about legacy, about a father whose health had made it necessary for new leadership to step forward. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. I walked in through the back gate. The first person who saw me was a line cook named Martinez, who dropped a serving tray. The clatter stopped Lorene mid-sentence. Then the crowd turned, one table at a time, like dominoes falling in slow motion. And the applause died the way a fire dies when you cut the oxygen. I walked through the silence in my old BBQ apron, with Eleanor's recipe box in my hands. 300 forks stopped moving. 300 faces tracked me across the patio. Brisket smoke hung in the evening air and mixed with Lorene's perfume as I passed within 3 feet of her and set the box on the head table. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I opened the brass latch and began laying out documents on the white tablecloth, one at a time, the way a pitmaster lays out cuts for inspection. You know what's louder than 300 people gasping? One old man in a barbecue apron not raising his voice. "Lorene, you were about to announce my retirement," I said. "Let me help." I placed the first invoice on the cloth. "Here's where the redirected vendor payments went." The second. "Here's what was paid to Dr. Callister for a fraudulent cognitive report." The third. "And here's the gas line inspection co-signed by a state inspector who confessed to the FBI last week." My grafted fingers trembled as I laid down each page. The new skin pulled tight across my knuckles. But my voice held. 8 weeks of practice. 8 weeks of performing. Calm for my daughter, while building the case behind her back, and now the performance was real. Lorene stood frozen at the podium, her mouth open on a word she would never finish. I watched something collapse behind her eyes, not surprise, not anger, but the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been waiting for this moment without knowing she'd been waiting. "Daddy, please," she said. "You don't understand everything." I understand the hidden real estate. I had 8 weeks in a hospital bed to understand it all. The crunch of gravel behind the patio fence. 3 black SUVs pulling into the lot. No sirens, no lights. Doors opening in unison. Voss appeared at the gate with his badge out and 2 agents flanking him. "Lorene Keach, Harlan Odom, FBI. You're under arrest. Do not move. Voss caught my eye for half a second. There's a second warrant on Odom, a narcotics case out of Houston, not part of your file. I'll explain later. Then he was already moving toward the head table. Harlan, who had been standing near the bar, set his glass down with the precision of a man who had known this was coming and had made his peace with it. He put his hands on the table and didn't resist. Lorene's hands went to her mouth, then behind her back. The handcuffs clicked in the silence between 300 held breaths. Breck was already gone. Back gate, rental car, I-35 south to the airport gone before the first handcuff clicked. He'd had an escape plan ready the whole time. He always intended to abandon Lorene once the scheme surfaced. That was the last thing Fielding's patients had purchased a head start. It didn't buy enough. Voss's text arrived 20 minutes later while I stood alone at the head table. The recipe box empty, every document spread under the string lights like a dealt hand. I looked at the screen. Fielding picked up at Bergstrom, one-way ticket, Grand Cayman. Didn't make it past gate B12. I set the phone down on the table beside the recipe box. The cedar lid was open, the brass latch catching the amber light. Eleanor's handwriting still on the inside. Keach Family Recipes, 1985, visible now above the empty space where 40 years of secrets and sauces had lived. Eleanor. I said to no one. That's all three. The gala crowd had scattered. Staff stood in clusters near the kitchen door, not speaking. The string lights swayed in the evening breeze. And somewhere on the highway, a siren faded toward Austin. Lorene sat in the back of a federal SUV with her wrists bound, staring through tinted glass at the restaurant sign that still bore her father's name. I could see her face in the window, not crying, not fighting, just looking at the sign. I stood there until the SUV pulled away. Then I was alone, with an empty box and a full silence, and the smell of brisket no one would finish eating. I asked Voss for 5 minutes alone with my daughter before they took her. He looked at me, burned arms, apron still tied, standing in the wreckage of my own celebration, and gave me 10. They brought Lorene back inside. The gala dining room was empty now, guests gone, staff dismissed. String lights still glowing over abandoned plates where brisket fat was congealing into cold white puddles. They sat her at a table still set for 300. Her wrists were cuffed in front of her. Mascara streaked down both cheeks in dark lines that made her look like she'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. I sat down across from her. The table between us held a half-eaten plate of cornbread and a glass of sweet tea, with the ice melted flat. The sirens had faded. The only sound was my daughter breathing. She didn't wait for me to ask. They came to me when the baby was still on the ventilator, she said. Her voice cracked on the word ventilator, the way a board cracks before it breaks. You hear it splitting, but it hasn't fallen yet. The bill was climbing every day. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. And Breck showed up at the hospital with a check and a smile and told me he could make it all disappear if I helped restructure some accounts. She wiped her face with her cuffed hands. The chain between them clinked against the table. I thought it was just the books. Daddy, just some vendor changes, just numbers on a screen. By the time I understood what was really moving through the trucks, I was already in it. And when I tried to stop, when I told them I wanted out, they said they'd restructure the shipping records to put your name on every invoice. They said you'd be the one indicted. Not them. Not me. You. How do you punish your own daughter when the things she did wrong started with trying to keep your granddaughter alive? I sat there and let her talk. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I didn't tell her I already knew about the email, the trust, the foundation, the monthly payments. I let her confess it in her own words because she needed to say it out loud more than I needed to hear it. I wasn't brave enough to come to you, she said. I thought if I just kept going, I could pay it off and undo it all before you ever found out. I thought I could fix it from the inside. And then they blew up your kitchen and I knew it was never going to stop. But by then I was so deep that coming to you meant admitting I'd almost gotten you killed. Her voice broke completely on the last word. She put her forehead on her cuffed hands and sobbed the ugly, shaking kind. The kind that comes from the chest, not the eyes. The kind I hadn't heard from her since the night Eleanor died. I reached across the table and put my hand on hers. The new skin on my fingers touched the cold metal of the handcuffs. And for a moment we sat like that, father and daughter, separated by steel and paper and 18 months of silence that should have been a conversation. You could have come to me with the dead, I said. Quietly, not angry, just true. I would have sold a location. I would have sold all 6. She looked up. Her eyes were red and swollen, and they were Eleanor's eyes, and they were my eyes. And they belonged to a woman who had been carrying a weight no 38-year-old should carry alone. I'd spent 8 weeks building a case against my own blood, and sitting there, holding her hands over a plate of cold cornbread, I wished every document was wrong. Voss appeared in the doorway. Time, Mr. Keech. I didn't look up. We'll take care of her, he said. She'll have a lawyer by morning. He paused. Then what it's worth, the NICU debt checks out. She was in over her head before Fielding ever touched your books. They led her out. I heard the SUV door close. I heard the engine start. I heard gravel under tires and then nothing. I sat alone at the table. The string lights swayed. On the floor beside my chair, a recipe card had fallen from the box during the commotion. Eleanor's handwritten dry rub formula, the ink faded, the edges soft and oil-stained from decades of use. I picked it up and held it between scarred fingers. Eleanor, I saved the restaurant, I said to the empty room. I don't know if I saved her. I folded the card into my shirt pocket, walked out through the back kitchen, past the new gas lines, past the rebuilt grill station, and climbed into my truck. I didn't drive home. I drove to the hospital, because there was someone there I'd never held, and I needed to hold something that hadn't been broken yet. She weighed 6 pounds and change. The nurse at the gala. One of the catering staff who'd also done pediatric training. It turned out had brought the baby out from the back office where Lorene had left her in a carrier before the speech. I took her in one arm the way I'd taken Lorene 38 years ago, and she settled against my chest like she'd been waiting for someone to hold her who wasn't in a hurry. I sat on the patio with my granddaughter asleep against my collarbone, still wearing my apron, still smelling like mesquite and antiseptic and the cold sweat of a man who had just dismantled his own family. Around me, the catering crew broke down tables, swept the patio, unplugged the string lights one by one until only moonlight remained. The baby's fist curled around my scarred index finger and held on. I had nowhere to take her. My kitchen had been destroyed in April. My house hadn't been lived in for 8 weeks. I had an empty recipe box, a truck in the parking lot, and a granddaughter who didn't know my name. Lorene looked exactly like this at 6 pounds. Same fists, same jaw. Same way of sleeping with her mouth slightly open, as though the world owed her air and she intended to collect. I held her the same way, one arm afraid I'd break her. The difference was that 38 years ago. Eleanor was beside me, and tonight the only person beside me was a caterer asking if I planned to leave. Sir, we need to lock up. 5 more minutes. I didn't move for 20. I sat there with formula and diaper powder mixing with the brisket smoke on my apron, and I told my granddaughter the only story that mattered. Your grandmother started this place with $600 and a cast-iron smoker, I whispered. You'll know that story. I'll make sure. A man can win everything back and still drive home with nothing, just an empty recipe box and a baby who doesn't know his name yet. I had saved the chain. I had exposed the conspiracy. I had walked into my own gala and laid truth on the table like a hand of cards. And now I sat alone on a patio in Round Rock, Texas, with my dead wife's granddaughter and no one to call. Except one person. Grady's truck pulled into the lot at 11:30. He didn't honk. He didn't call. He just appeared, the way he'd appeared at every hard moment in 25 years of friendship, without being asked, without explanation, without a single unnecessary word. He walked across the empty patio, looked at the baby in my arms, and picked up the carrier from the chair beside me. He didn't ask what happened. He'd been watching from across the highway in his truck when the FBI moved in. He knew. We drove 30 miles to Dripping Springs without saying a word. The highway hum filled the cab. The baby slept in the carrier between us. Her shallow breaths the only sound either of us needed. Grady handed me a styrofoam cup of cold coffee at some point at a gas station. Black. The same kind we'd shared during late-night evidence sessions in my hospital room. I drank it. It tasted like the end of something and the beginning of something else. That wasn't silence. That was two men deciding whether they were still family. My mind wasn't even fully on Grady. It kept drifting to Harlan. Harlan had betrayed me too, in the smallest way a man can. He'd known about the supply chain irregularities before he told me. Waited 4 days out of fear. He'd cooperated with the FBI not just out of loyalty, but because Voss had made it clear that cooperation was his only path away from accessory charges. I knew all of that. I'd known it for weeks, but Grady was here. At 11:30 on the worst night of my life, he was here, with a truck and a cup of coffee and silence that asked for nothing. We reached the ranch gate. The hill country stretched out dark and quiet under a moon that didn't care about indictments or recipes or daughters in handcuffs. I looked at the house, limestone and cedar. Porch light on. A place that smelled like cedar and honest work. I built that place with her mother, I said. Grady looked at the road. After a long pause, he nodded once. Guest room's made up, he said. Baby can sleep in the reading chair with the cushions. Thank you. Grady. I said it slow. The way you say something you mean all the way down. He heard it. I meant it. I laid the baby in the makeshift cushion bed and stood at Grady's kitchen window, looking out at the dark hill country. My phone lit up on the counter. A notification from Voss. Fielding is cooperating. Full statement by morning. You'll want to read it. I turned the phone face down and watched the baby sleep instead. I read Voss's text the next morning while the baby slept in her carrier on Grady's kitchen table. Fielding was cooperating. Good. I poured cold coffee and sat with that word, cooperating, until it stopped meaning anything at all. The indictments came down on a Tuesday. 14 counts across 4 names, and my phone didn't stop buzzing until I pulled the battery out. Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit arson. Money laundering through shell entities. Insurance fraud. The list read like a textbook, except every chapter was a piece of my life somebody had tried to strip for parts. Voss called from a landline when he couldn't reach my cell. Fielding's looking at 18 to 22 years, he said, his tone flat. The way agents talk when the case is won and the adrenaline is gone. Odom's narcotics case is separate from ours. The DEA had been building it for over a year, tied to a supplier network from before he ever worked for me. Could add another 15 years. Callister will never practice medicine again. I should have felt something sharp. Victory, maybe. Or at least the clean edge of vindication. Instead, it landed like a rock dropped into mud. A dull thud, and then stillness. There's something else, Voss continued. Fielding's cooperation statement. He identified your chain as a target 2 full years before he ever contacted Lorene. He'd been mapping your locations, your vendor contracts, your debt exposure. The hospital bills weren't what drew him in. They were just the lever he found once he was already inside. 2 years. While I was seasoning briskets and balancing payroll and visiting Eleanor's grave on Sundays. A man I'd never met was circling my family like a surveyor marking demolition lines. The NICU bills hadn't been bad luck that attracted a predator. They'd been a door he was already looking for. And Laureen? I asked. Her attorney's negotiating. The coercion evidence is strong, the emails, the threats. I'd expect 3 to 5. Maybe less with cooperation credit. Every sentence felt like a door closing. Some of them I wanted closed. One of them I didn't. You think justice feels like celebration. It doesn't. It feels like inventory counting, what's left on the shelves after the fire sale. Trying to remember what the store looked like when it was full. The weeks ground forward. Pruitt took his probation deal and disappeared from Round Rock the same afternoon his house listed before the ink dried. Callister's suspension made the Austin American-Statesman, 4 paragraphs on page 6, sandwiched between a school board scandal and a water main break. Odom's arraignment happened in a federal courtroom I never entered. Grady went. He said Odom looked 10 years older and said nothing. I kept the baby. Not formally, the custody paperwork was still winding through family court, but practically, daily, in every way that mattered. I learned which cry meant hunger and which meant gas. I learned that she'd stop fussing if I hummed low enough, the same way Eleanor used to hum over the cutting board. I learned that 4 in the morning is the loneliest hour unless someone needs you, and then it becomes the most necessary. In late July, Petra called. "Guardianship dismissed," she said. "All 6 locations, full ownership, no encumbrances. It's yours again, every bit of it." I stood in Grady's kitchen, holding a bottle in one hand and the phone in the other. And what came out of my mouth surprised even me. "Eleanor and I started with $600, I said. "I don't need anyone to tell me what's mine." Petra paused. "One more thing. Laureen's plea hearing is set for August 12th. She's asked if you'll be there." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because the answer was heavier than I wanted to carry over the phone. That afternoon, I drove to the flagship for the first time since the explosion. The contractors had finished 3 weeks earlier, but I'd stayed away. Finding reasons, the baby, the depositions, the August heat. The truth was simpler. I was afraid of what it would feel like to walk back in. Turning on that pilot light was the smallest thing I did all summer, and the only one that made me feel like myself. It clicked 3 times before catching, a sound I hadn't heard in 4 months. And then the blue flame curled under the new grill grates like it had never left. The kitchen smelled like fresh gas line and new paint. Nothing like smoke. Nothing like memory. Not yet. I pulled Eleanor's recipe card from my shirt pocket. The edges had gone soft from weeks of carrying. The dry rub formula written in her slanted hand, faded but legible. I pinned it to the wall above the station where the explosion had started. Right there, where the fire had been hottest. I cut a test slice from the first brisket off the new smoker. Not quite right yet. Close, though. Close enough to keep going. Then I picked up my phone and called Laureen's attorney back. I told Laureen's attorney I'd be there on the 12th. Then I hung up and stood in the quiet kitchen, the pilot light hissing beneath the grates, and asked myself a question I didn't have an answer for yet. How do you reopen a restaurant that tried to kill you? You start with the people who didn't. I called Jolene Ashby on a Wednesday morning and asked her to meet me at the flagship before the contractors finished hauling out the last of the old ductwork. She showed up in pressed slacks and a company polo, the same way she'd shown up every day while the world was falling apart around her. "Jolene, you risked your job to document what they were shipping through our loading docks," I said. "I'm giving you a title that matches your spine. Director of Compliance. All 6 locations, every invoice, every vendor contract, every inspection. Yours to audit, yours to flag, no one between you and me." She looked at the floor, then at the new grill hoods, then back at me. I just kept the books honest. Mr. Keach. That's the hardest thing anyone did in this whole mess. I gave Grady a framed letter. He told me to stop making a fuss, which is exactly what Grady would say to a man handing him formal recognition for helping dismantle a federal conspiracy. He hung it in his barn office, next to a photograph of his late wife. and that told me more than any thank you speech could have. Reopening morning. I stood in front of 16 employees in the dining room and said the only thing that mattered. New rule. If something smells wrong, and I don't mean the brisket, you come to me. Not a manager, not a lawyer, me. This chain runs on trust now, or it doesn't run. If you've stayed with me this long, you already know. The money was never the point. The chain was never the point. It was always about who walks through the door with you when everything else has burned down. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Plain envelope, no return address. But I knew the handwriting before I opened it. Lorene's cursive tight, controlled. The way Eleanor taught her in 3rd grade at the kitchen table with lined paper and a number 2 pencil. 5 words on a single sheet. I'm sorry. Daddy. I'm sorry. I sat in my office with the door closed for a long time. The fluorescent buzz overhead had been replaced during the renovation with warmer fixtures. Copper-toned hoods that threw soft light across the desk. Eleanor's photo sat in its usual spot. Lorene at 7, holding a spatula taller than she was, grinning at something off camera. The recipe box beside it. Emptied of evidence now. Just a wooden box again. I placed the letter inside the box, next to the photo. Then I closed the drawer. I didn't lock it. I didn't frame the letter. I didn't throw it away. I put it where I'd have to decide what to do with it every single time I opened that drawer. That felt more honest than any verdict. She's got your stubbornness, I said to Eleanor's photograph. I hope she's got your courage, too. The baby was in her carrier on the prep counter, babbling at the stainless steel reflection of her own face. 4 months old and already fascinated by kitchens. I lifted her out and settled her against my shoulder. One hand beneath her, the other reaching for the apron on the hook by the door. I tied it one-handed, a skill I'd learned in the burn unit, relearned in Grady's kitchen, and perfected here in the weeks since coming back. The smoker fan hummed to life. Hickory smoke curled from the chamber and mixed with baby powder and new paint. A combination that had no business smelling like home, but did. Eleanor's recipe card was still pinned above the station, her faded handwriting catching the light from the copper hoods. I reached up and touched the corner of the card where her writing started. Just the corner. Just enough. Your grandmother built this place, I told the baby, who grabbed my collar and drooled on it in response. Your mama almost broke it, and you're going to learn the dry rub before you learn to read. I walked into this kitchen 41 years ago with Eleanor and $600. I walked into the gala with a recipe box full of evidence and the truth on my side. And I walked into it tonight with her granddaughter on my shoulder and everything that matters. I turned on the smoker and got back to work. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 41 years building something with my bare hands. A restaurant, a family, a legacy. And I nearly lost all of it because I trusted the wrong people with the right things. I handed over passwords, keys, and authority to people who smiled at me over Sunday dinner and plotted behind Monday's closed doors. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for the smoke to clear before you ask where the fire started. This was a revenge story, but not the kind you might expect. I didn't get even by shouting or scheming. I got even by paying attention, by listening to the people who had nothing to gain from telling me the truth. The real revenge story isn't about destroying the ones who hurt you. It's about refusing to let them destroy what you built. I believe God put me through this fire for a reason. Not to burn me down, but to show me what was fireproof, my friends, my granddaughter, and the recipe my wife left on a card I carried in my shirt pocket for 4 months. Every revenge story has a turning point, and mine was choosing to rebuild instead of ruin. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have shown up at your daughter's plea hearing? Or would you have stayed home? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for storytelling purposes. But the lessons about trust, about family, about knowing when to fight and when to forgive those are as real as it gets.